Welcome to our scholarly panel. I'm Patricia Malden. I am a professor at the GMU Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And the panel today are a series of experts on different aspects of carceral and advocacy and justice issues. So what we're going to do is, in each specialist will introduce themselves and then speak about the work that they're doing and how that impacts themselves and others. And then when everyone has spoken, we will come back and do a question and answer session from the audience. So take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Janani Umamaheshwar. I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason. I'm trained as a sociologist, even though I work in a criminology department. I consider myself a prison researcher. I'm broadly interested in punishment. And what brings me to this work is kind of a really deep interest in understanding how our system creates but also perpetuates existing harms. And I think about that really broadly. So I have done field work in women's prisons and in men's prisons. I've spoken to men who are wrongfully convicted, and I'm now studying how families are harmed by the prison system as well. So I take a really broad lens. I got into this work, and I do field work in prisons partly because it's become, and it still is, really hard to do that here in America. It's very, very difficult for researchers to get into prisons, and I think that that's partly because prisons don't often want other people to know what's going on in there, so they make it deliberately very, very difficult for us to speak to people who are incarcerated and for us to write about those realities. So I kind of took it on as a challenge, and I was kind of startled by the artists before we're talking about it, by the humanity that you encounter in there, whether you're in a women's prison or a men's prison. And it manifests in very similar ways, no matter which context you're in, whether you're studying and learning from women or men. That has kind of propelled it. Obviously, COVID has made it really hard. Now it's even harder in many ways to learn what's going on in prison, even though I think it's more important now to know what's going on in prison because it's been nightmarish for folks who are incarcerated since the pandemic. And I think all of us know this, at least indirectly, but I think we're really, really, it's tip of the iceberg in terms of our knowledge base on that. So I came into this work more interested in gender and masculinity later on. I've since made my interest much broader. I'm interested in inequality, so that's racism, that's homophobia, that's gender-related stuff, that's class-related stuff. How do all of these inequalities show up in the prison system? How do they follow people, from the point at which they are born to the point at which they come into contact with the system in the first place, to the point at which they are incarcerated, and then how does it follow them when they leave? So I take that deliberately broad life perspective to understand disadvantage as it accumulates and what we can do to disrupt the disadvantage in various points in the system. And then, now I'm also just interested in families as well, because I think we know how much families are harmed by system contact, but they're often erased. They're in some ways erased even more than people who are incarcerated themselves, because one of the artists mentioned the other day, just in the panel before that we have this voyeuristic tendency with people who are incarcerated, right? We listen to the podcasts and we watch the shows and we're fascinated. What goes on behind those walls? And as we should be, I don't think for those reasons. I don't think we should be interested because it's entertaining to us. We should be interested because we care. But I think families get lost in that mix a lot of the time. They're often the invisible victims of the system. So my view on it is whether somebody has actually committed the crime for which they are convicted or not, the injustice that they experience in the prison setting can't often be justified. And I think the only way to get at that is to understand their lived experiences. And so as hard as it is to do field work, as hard as it is to go into prisons and hear these stories, I don't mean emotionally, it may be hard emotionally, but that's my privilege talking, right? As hard as it is logistically to do it, I think the burden is on us as academics to actually do that work, to figure out a way to make it happen despite all the pressures coming from so many different directions, professionally and socially. How can we continue to shed light on what's happening in there, and what can we do to disrupt that? So that's the perspective I bring, and I know that many of the people on the panel share at least some of that perspective, so I'll just turn the mic over to them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keisha Middlemass. I am on faculty at Howard University. I am in the Department of Political Science. I'm a classically trained political scientist. In other words, I went through a PhD program in political science and American politics out of University of Georgia, go Dogs. And I was taught about institutions, and I was taught about political behavior, and then another part of my PhD was about public policies. But the two never seemed to combine themselves, like they were taught as very separate silos. And so doing my dissertation work, I was looking at voting rights and the Voting Rights Act and its implementation, and then the presidential election of 2000 and hanging chads and Jeb literally removing people from the voting rolls, and all of a sudden felon disenfranchisement laws was on the national agenda. And so I looked for opportunities to complete my work for my dissertation, because a done dissertation is the only thing that matters, and make a complete left-hand turn to look at felon disenfranchisement laws. And then that expanded into all the other policies that affect individuals with a felony conviction. I thought that I would do sort of because this is how I was trained, political scientists, we actually don't talk to people. So I thought I would just sort of parachute in, or not even parachute in, hang glide over these public policies and never actually talk to people. I ended up having to retrain myself, literally go get the methods training to do ethnographic research, because political scientists aren't taught how to interact with people. But I took it on as my challenge. It's like, if I'm going to tell this story about the effect politics and policies have connected to a felony conviction, I have to go talk to people who are experiencing these things. And so my work largely looks at, yes, lived experiences. I interview people, I do focus groups, I interact with their families, but it's all on the outside. I, too, had lots of problems trying to get inside, and decided, you know what? I've made enough contacts with people in the nonprofit world. This was in Newark, New Jersey, and New York at the time, and ended up teaching a GED course. I ended up doing focus groups on language and listening to them about vocabulary. So back to that education component, like, let's get you your GED, let's get your high school equivalents. And then they started talking to me, because once you break that trust, because, you know, I'm a suburban girl, they knew I was sort of like, who is this chick? Who does she think she is? She's coming in here telling us how to do math, but she doesn't know what we're talking about. But you show up every single day, and all of a sudden people start telling you their stories. They'll introduce you to their kids. Breaking bread is a great way to do it. You bring sandwiches, and not with zero expectation that they'll talk to me. But just the whole idea is that I'm here for your humanity, and I know we meet at lunchtime and you're probably hungry, and in New York City a sandwich is $10, so here's a sandwich. Stay if you want. So that research then expanded, and taking those lived experiences but connecting them to actual public policies. So why do so many people that serve time in prison who do not have family are homeless? Well, you could blame it on the individual, and that is generally what society does. But I took a step back and started looking at systems and that whole interconnection of a felony conviction across all the public policies outside of the criminal justice system. So housing, food stamps, family reunification, when you lose your parental rights because of a felony conviction, when you are unable to live in certain public housing units because of a felony conviction, when you start going out and trying to find a job and check the box, and you're not even reviewed as a worthy candidate because you checked the box that you got a felony conviction in the last X number of years. And all those policies create this web that really restricts people from interacting in society. So from an academic perspective, I use social disability theory and argue that the felony conviction creates a social disability. It's not that someone's physically disabled, but the felony conviction hinders them from interacting with society. It's like when someone's in a wheelchair and there's no curb ramps. How do they get up on the curb? Well, with a felony conviction, there is no curb ramps. There's no equivalent of a curb ramp. And you can do everything right and still get caught up back in the system because of all the rules outside of the criminal justice system. So I spend lots of time connecting those and then advocating for individuals via nonprofit organizations and do consulting. So I work with nonprofit organizations, like, you're all competing for the small little pie. You're all doing housing, you're all doing education, you're all doing little parts of the re-entry work. Why don't you specialize in housing, and you specialize in this, and you specialize in this, and then we write grants for your specialty instead of you all competing for the same $200,000 grant. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, we don't have to compete, right? Like light bulb goes off and you're sort of like, oh, we don't have to compete. And sometimes just having someone come in and show them a different way, and all of a sudden we can help more people. So I'm really trying to connect my work to helping those that are coming home, and now doing that in DC instead of New York and Newark. But it's great to be here, great to be on this panel. Thank you.
All right, I'm Liz Komar. Can you hear this on? Yes. Okay. And I'm here from the Sentencing Project. The Sentencing Project is about a 30-year-old research and advocacy organization, and our focus is really on extreme sentences. I am not, by the way, a researcher. That means I'm the person on this panel who knows the least about math. I'm a lawyer. And so I'm going to be sharing some of the research from my colleagues, Dr. Ashley Nellis and Dr. Nazgul Ganoush, who focus on measuring extreme sentenced individuals in prison. So measuring the prison population and the various contributors to those population levels. And so I'm going to share a few slides because it's easiest to share this research through images. And all right, so the first slide. So this year we're marking 50 years of mass incarceration. So that's 50 years since the national prison population began its very steep increase. And as you can see, we're beginning to come down, and that's a really important thing to celebrate, especially the decades of work that advocates on the ground have put into making that possible. But if we continue at our current pace of decarceration, it's still going to take us another 75 years to get back to where we were 50 years ago. And it's important to investigate why and pursue policy solutions that speak to that. So next slide. So how did we get here? And I think a common narrative is the drug war, and it's not wrong. It's been a really significant contributor, especially at the federal level. But currently 17% of the national prison population is serving a sentence for drugs, and 56% are incarcerated for violent offenses. And so it's important to think about solutions that address that, and also how we can do so safely. Next slide. So this graph shows the U.S. prison population by conviction offense, and so you'll see that the percentage of people in prison for violent crimes has dramatically risen since the 1980s. And keep in mind, this isn't percentage of people convicted every year, it's the prison population. So it shows that when we convict people of a violent crime, we've increasingly begun locking them up forever. And that's because of changes like the rise of life without parole sentencing, truth in sentencing laws, habitual offender laws like 3 strikes. And so that's some of the kinds of laws that we focus on addressing. Next slide. So my colleague, Dr. Nellis, specifically measures life sentences. And so today, 1 in 7 people in the US are serving life sentences. Compare that to the 2,300-ish people who are currently serving death sentences. So we've condemned so many people to die in prison, but it's unfortunately not as much as a public focus often as capital punishment. Next slide. And so here you can see the kinds of offenses that generally result in those life sentences. It's often very serious crimes, so things like murder, sex-related offenses, violent robberies. And so that's part of what we're reckoning with when we're reckoning with ending mass incarceration. Next slide. And so it's not just, though, that we're increasingly sentencing people to life. Sentences all around have grown over the last 50 years. And that means also that the proportion of people serving sentences over 10 years is also significantly higher than it used to be even 20 years ago. So next slide. And of course, who does this disproportionately impact? People of color. Disproportionately, it is Black men who are serving the longest sentences. Those disparities are generally higher as the sentences go up. You can go to the next slide. And so why is that? Well, it's a story that I think many of us know, that at every stage of the criminal legal system, there's bias, and those biases compound. So people are arrested more, they're charged more, they receive worse plea bargains, they receive them longer sentences, and they're getting arrested, charged, and sentenced more, and those criminal histories over time result in longer sentences. Next slide. So our policy solutions that we focus on at least our campaign to end life imprisonment, begin with second look sentencing. So this is my colleague, Bill Underwood, who received compassionate release after 33 years in federal prison, serving a life sentence, came home a little over 2 years ago now. That's his daughter, Ebony Underwood, who runs We Got Us Now, which is an organization for the children of incarcerated parents. They're my favorite criminal justice superstar duo. All right, next slide. So these are some examples of second look reform. So these are opportunities for people who are already in prison to receive a new sentence, or a sentence that reflects maybe their youth, what we know about brain development at the time they were convicted, sentences that reflect the way they've been rehabilitated, sentences that can reflect changes in laws, that we just punish certain offenses less harshly now. So this is still a new concept, but it's gradually gaining ground, and most of our advocacy work involves trying to pass different kinds of resentencing bills. And next slide. And thankfully, this is an idea that's gaining credibility with the legal mainstream, at least. So it's now in the model penal code, which is very exciting to lawyers, no one else. And then next slide. And also the American Bar Association now recommends second look, which is very exciting. And next slide. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that we can do things like this. We can dramatically shorten sentences. We can let people out of prison after 10, 20 years. And that's because the people serving the longest sentences recidivate the least. Next slide. We know that in part because we have some real-life populations of folks we can study. One is this group known as the Ungers, a group of elderly, mostly life-sentenced individuals who came home in Maryland as a result of a legal victory. And you can see, of course, the racial disparities in who the Ungers were, and they're all doing, for the most part, wonderfully. They need a lot of specialized reentry support, but they are a tremendous success story that demonstrates, there are so many aging people in prison who can come home. Next slide. And so I'm kind of zooming through the academic rationales for shortening sentences and second looks, but one is that criminal careers are really short. People don't commit crimes for forever. Next slide. Also, we know that lengthening sentences doesn't deter crime. People don't sit down and look at whether or not they're going to get 20 years or 50 years for an offense before doing it. So we can follow the model of other countries and impose shorter sentences without harming public safety. Next slide. And there's other ways that we can make communities safer. And so those are all sorts of things that are preventative, that are diversion, that are healing oriented. And so we encourage lawmakers to consider things like these. And the next slide. And so these are some of the specific policy goals that we work towards. So abolishing life sentences, eliminating mandatory minimums, universal second look, capping maximum sentences at 20 years, and then also just a lot of defensive work to prevent people from returning to the 80s and 90s. And next slide. And so if anybody wants to engage, join our listserv. We'll show you some ways to take action, but also there's a lot of other ways to contribute to lowering extreme sentencing, ending mass incarceration. I'm happy to speak to them on any questions. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria Valdivinos Olsen. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology here at Mason. I consider myself a reentry scholar. Broadly, I do policing research, corrections research, and reentry, but I really do consider myself a reentry scholar. And the reason I care about reentry is because it is a massive problem in society. So just to throw out a few numbers to kind of put it into context. So in the 1930s, President Roosevelt gave a presentation at the National Parole Conference. And at that time, he was talking about a returning population of about 60,000 individuals. And there's a quote that he talked about how the reentry, or the project of helping people come home, was the area where we had done the least work in, right? And there really wasn't much work that went into reentry for decades. So fast forward to the 2000s, after we've started to see the massive consequences that were coming back home. And even today, the number has dropped because of decarceration efforts and changes in sentencing reform, etc. But even today, we're talking about annually about 500,000 individuals coming home from state prison every year. Annually, about 10 million people cycling in and out of jail every year. So it's an enormous problem. One last figure that I will make a note of is in 2018, there were about 4.5 million individuals that were navigating reentry. And so, but what is reentry, right? What does reentry entail? So for me, I'm here to talk a little bit about my dissertation research, in which I focus on kind of what are some of the best ways that we can organize the provision of reentry services to maximize success within this huge reentry landscape, which is really not very cohesive. And so that really is like the broader focus, and specifically what I'm doing is I'm looking at a reentry network in Philadelphia, and I'm looking at how different elements of that network interact, so such as network governance, provider organizational practice, and then also service need alignment, and how those elements interact, not only to support reentry, but also to undermine it, because there are some interesting ways in which policies and processes that are intended to help people actually don't help people. So I'm very much excited to be part of this conversation in this panel today. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open some questions out to the audience in a moment, but this is me. Super predator theory. Just slap it down on the table. And social death. Okay, take it away. Anybody have any comments?
Who doesn't?
Yeah, about the idea of super predator? Oh my goodness.
Okay,
Yeah.
let it fly.
I mean, it's one of the most harmful things that happened in our political and social history. They just threw out the term, and I think that as somebody who's housed in a criminology department, we really need to be held accountable for that, because they cited criminological research to argue that there was this rise of the dangerous young black man, and they rolled with it in the political scene, and that's a huge reason why we're where we are right now. And I don't know that academics have really contended with that, with how culpable we are. Like, we do a lot of this work and we say, oh, we're on the right side of it and we're trying to do the social justice stuff, and now it sounds really good in 2023, but where were we in the 90s? We were out there trying to supply the research that basically played a huge pivotal role in mass incarceration. So And it hasn't left, right? I mean, the research has debunked it over and over again. There was no super predator generation. There was no such thing. And we may not be, and the media finally got tired of it as well, so we don't see the term itself used all that much, but the stereotype still persists, right? We're still constantly equating black men with crime, and then we wonder why we are where we are, why prisons look the way they do, right? I think academics are very culpable for some of that harm.
Language is so very, very important. And academics don't think about language in the way that it then ripples into the political world. And sometimes it's the politicians that then say the words and then academics will latch onto it. So think about welfare queen. Article in Chicago newspaper in 1975-76, Reagan picks it up. It becomes a whole term to recreate the welfare system. And then Clinton picks it up and makes deals with the Republicans in the 1990s, and all of a sudden it's welfare and work. We think about super predator and how those two words become a whole set of policies to punish largely black boys and men, but then in the 2000s it's black women. And so the language becomes really, really important. And I know academics and those outside of academia talk about, oh, we got to use first-person language. So individuals with a felony conviction instead of felons. But we also have to think about not just first-person language, but language that then is used by others outside of academia. Like it's not we have theoretical debates. And then there's some of us that are on the ground that are actually talking to people, and we see the harm of that language. So co-sign everything that was just said about super predator, and we have not, as academics, really interrogated it. But you start thinking about truth in sentencing. Who's being truthful and who's being sentenced? But we also have to think about the project of white supremacy in this country, and how we don't have Jim Crow in theory, but in practice we do in how we settle housing. We're mostly segregated we're the most segregated on Sunday mornings when you think about church, but you also think about the segregated high schools, and you think about where segregation then comes in employment, and then you've got a Supreme Court saying, oh, we're not racist anymore, we don't need affirmative action, black people are doing fine, we elected a black man to the White House, and you're sort of like, yeah, but. And so we really have to wrestle with these concepts, but also how they're embedded into the practice of public policies, which then just repeats themselves in different ways.
And just to speak about a policy intervention that can be helpful in unwinding some of that harm, our second look laws that are focused specifically on people convicted under 18, but also under 25 ideally, because we know from brain development science that at 22 you have a lot more in common with a 15-year-old than you do, with the 35-year-olds. That really those are just old teenagers, and that we should give them the same level of leeway and reconsideration that we would to someone who is convicted as a minor. So DC and Maryland have second look laws that provide resentencing opportunities to people convicted as teenagers and emerging adults. But in DC, I think we recently saw that the mayor, proposed unwinding IRA, which is the name of the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act that provides that resentencing opportunity. Congress also blocked DC from expanding that into a universal second look law. And then meanwhile, we also see opportunities to make carjacking laws even harsher in response to narratives about youth engaging in carjacking rampages, and not instead conversations about how do we keep those youth out of harm, how are we failing youth. And so I think that's really captures how the super predator myth is still with us today. That even though we know so much more about how we got to this point of mass incarceration and all the mistakes that were made with it, we're still struggling to unwind it and also continuing to lean into myths and harmful policies because of it.
think I just have some very brief remarks on the super predator. I think we as academics and professionals know a lot more, but the general public doesn't necessarily know what we know, right? And I don't know how to change that. I mean, we could communicate better, right? So part of it is on us, but part of it is also on the general public wanting to really understand, to really learn more. In 2017, I worked in a project that took me into the LA County jails. And so I went there to learn more about how they were approaching the issue of rehabilitation. And they had a couple of mottos. One of them was that to them guided their work, their mission every day. And so one of them was that today's inmate is tomorrow's neighbor. And so the way that they looked at that was that when they got somebody in, they wanted, especially because in jails, generally like those stays are much shorter than if you're in state prison, they really wanted to hit the ground running with this individual and try to figure out what exactly was it that led them to jail in the first place. Were there any particular services that they could provide in order to help them during their stay there before they went back into the community? And I think if, as the general public, we understood that is very accurate, today's inmate is going to be tomorrow's neighbor, we might care a little bit more, right, about trying to understand more scientifically, right? What are some ways that, what are some of the things that are driving the super predator myths, right? And how those are not true, not real, not based in science or, for example, development and that sort of thing, and that they're politicized and kind of cloud our judgment. And so if we knew a little bit more, we might be able to be more discerning as the general public about that kind of stuff.
I have one question about the increase in carjacking. Yes, not one question, long comment. There are increased carjacking, but we have to look at why, and it's the technology changes. You must now have your key fob to start a car. You can't hotwire a car. Well, how do you get a key fob if someone's in their car? Because if you walk away from your car from 20 or 30 feet, your engine will actually stop. But now you need the key fob, and because of car and technology advancements, more people are getting carjacked because they can't hotwire a car anymore. And so it's like we have advances in technology, and then a crime will respond to those advances in technology, but we're only talking about the increase in carjacking. And I'm sort of like, car companies, let people hotwire a car. Take my car, I have insurance, but I won't get hurt. But I could get hurt because you need my key fob if somebody wants to steal my car. But just sort of that whole advancing in technology, whenever I hear carjacking now, I'm like, time out, wait. It's increasing because it's a response to technology. Not saying it doesn't address the carjacking, but let's talk about why it's increasing. The same youth are still on the streets, and they weren't doing more carjacking 4 years ago, but now they are because technology has changed. Yes, not a fix, but.
It's a start. All right, so that was spirited. Well done. One more, social death. ¿Cómo es social death?
Okay, sure.
I know you can.
Yeah, when we think of social death, I mean, we really put an end to people's ability to participate fully as human beings in our community once they've been incarcerated, right? And the way we see that most obviously, the one that's talked about a lot is felony disenfranchisement, right? We take away their right to vote, and that's sort of inherently meaning that they are not full citizens in our community anymore. But it happens in so many different ways. It's one of the most startling things, I think, to teach students for the first time when they realize that it's not just that they lose the right to vote, it's that they lose driver's licenses in some cases. They lose their ability to get trainings. The very things that they're trained for in prison, they can no longer do when they're outside prison because they're not eligible, right? So what are we doing, what are we training them for? To be electricians or to be plumbers or whatever, so just so that they can come outside and realize, oh no, that means you will be given access to somebody's property and you're a threat to the society, so we're not going to give you that license, right? So we take away access to employment. We say, well, anyone can, there are jobs to be had. If you wanted it badly enough, you'd be able to get the jobs, but then they run that background check and that's that. So ban the box initiatives, those have gone some way in redressing that, right? At least we're getting people to the point of an interview where they can plead their case, where they can put it, where employers are forced to confront that this is a human, that they have a story that's actually much more complicated than what their record might suggest. That's helping to some degree. But we strip them of their ability to literally eat, right? We take away their access to welfare benefits. So they are hungry. We take away their right to live in public housing, so they are homeless. So they don't have jobs, they don't have homes, they don't have food, they lose custody of their children, so they don't have family. And then we wonder, oh, it must be that you're just inherently criminal, because why do you keep ending up in prison? What have we done to kind of help them do better? And in fact, what have we not done to ensure that they get back into prison? One of the most frustrating parts of working in this space is knowing that we don't have to invent the wheel on this. There are countries that are doing it better than we are. We used to do it better than we are doing it right now. We've regressed, right? This doesn't have to be the way it is, and we are an extremely wealthy nation. If we were to allocate even a portion of the funds that we spend on prisons, on the military, on these other institutions, on the police force, if we were to relocate them to welfare, to social stability, to giving people that safety net that we know works, that we have known for decades works, then maybe they would be able to participate as full citizens. And maybe that would help them actually feel connected to the community in a way that prevents them from committing crime again, even if the opportunity does arise for them to do that, right? I don't know, I would challenge anybody in this room to not feel resentful of the state and the community that put you in that position if you came out of prison, and then try telling you at that moment, do you want to continue down this path that is utterly hopeless, right? Everywhere you turn, it's hopeless. Or do you want to do what has come most easily to you from being in the street and then being in prison, and knowing that violence gets you places, that violence is rewarded, that crime is rewarded in many instances? It's a very logical choice. And for most people, they're not even thinking about it in those terms. They're not thinking about it rationally. It's survival. I spoke to somebody who was homeless on the street, and we were in Manhattan, in one of the most affluent areas, and he said he was a veteran. And he's like, I lost my leg for this country, and now they won't even make eye contact with me. They will not even recognize me as a human being. And he says, I don't want to commit a crime. And I'll never forget the quote he said, even cockroaches have to survive. That is what we reduce people to, right? He's come out of prison, he is homeless, he's got wounds on his arm that are infected. Healthcare is not even close to an option. If food isn't even a guaranteed right, what is healthcare, right? And he says, that's what he's been reduced to. He sees himself as a cockroach. And he's like, it is base survival at that point. So we're talking social death, yes, but in many, many instances, we're talking quite literal physical death too, right? And we can do better. We make political choices every single day not to do better.
Maria earlier shared the numbers of people re-entering. And so whenever I now go to public meetings, so when elected officials have meetings, I ask them, I don't care if they're local, state, or nationally elected office, what are you doing to keep me safe? Because now people are coming home. And they sort of look at me like, what do you mean I'm keeping you safe? I've got tough on punishment. I'm like, no, those people are incarcerated. I want to know, what are you doing for the 10 or 12,000 people that are coming home every single week in this country? What are you doing to help them be good citizens? What are you as an elected official doing to make sure they don't have to commit another crime? And they mumble, and then go to someone else. Don't answer the question. But I encourage, how can you help? It's like, we got to change the dynamics. It's not locking people up for life. It's not locking people up for 25 or 30 years. Because 95, 96, 97% of everybody that's incarcerated will eventually come home. So I want elected officials now to start thinking about, well, what are you doing for those individuals that are coming home? You're not fixing my roads, you're not keeping the green space updated, you're not putting new lights in the lights that are burned out on the sidewalks. The buses don't run as frequently, the trains don't run as frequently, so I know you're not investing in my public well-being, but what are you doing for those thousands of people that are returning home to this area, district, whatever jurisdiction? But that's one way to start changing the conversation, because right now it's $1 billion to the criminal justice system and like $100 to reentry when we're looking at public funding disparities in how we allocate our tax dollars.
I'm going to leave this one to the reentry specialists.
On the question of social death, one other way in which we perpetuate social death for people that are coming home is through criminal records, right? They are everywhere. There's a whole industry, right, that runs criminal background checks for everything you can possibly think of. If I really wanted to, I could find somebody's criminal history or mugshot if I just spent enough time on Google, right? I could look them up. So there are definitely financial incentives, right, that feed into these kinds of industries that help perpetuate social death. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be as damaging. Do I think, you know, being able to query criminal records is an important thing? Yes, definitely, right? Either for tenancy purposes or for employment purposes or whatever. But having committed an offense 30 years ago should not continue to determine whether or not you can get an apartment. And that is something that I've come across in interviews that I've done with formerly incarcerated individuals that are still, you know, navigating reentry, even 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years out, right? These are challenges that they are still having to deal with. And that is very much tied to the criminal record, which is what perpetuates the social death for the individual and society.
That was awesome. Thank you all. Thank you, panel. Any last rants, comments? And this is one of the, I mean, this is the idea of the carceral system as it stands now is an abomination, in my view. And I think there's been significant evidence to support that. And if you have a family member in carceral spaces, you know exactly how horrible it is. And yeah, so I've had, you know, anyway. So thank you very much for your comments and the grit with which you presented them.